I'm a professor, and I can recall a time when I was instructed not to step foot inside the classroom. See, about 3 years ago, I was teaching at a small college, and I was fortunate enough to have just had my second baby. And about 2 weeks after she was born, I was headed back to work. And as I was getting ready, I thought, am I crazy? Who goes back to work 2 weeks after having a baby? And I told myself, well, it'll be nice to get out of the house for a couple hours. But if I was being honest, I'd say the real reason I was going back to work was because if I didn't, I was going to lose my pay. See, I was a part-time faculty member and I didn't have family leave. So I got ready and I went to my office. And about 5 minutes before my class began, I got an email from Human Resources. And it said, it's just come to our attention that you've had a baby and we need a note from your doctor before you can step foot inside your classroom. Look, what could I do? I had 5 minutes. Could I call my doctor? I could try. So I did, and she wasn't there. But her assistant said, look, if I can track her down and get her to fax over a note saying you're clear to teach, then I'll call you and confirm. Really hoping I'd get that call. I got my things together, and I walked down the hall toward my classroom. I stopped short just outside the door. I stood out there and greeted my students as they came in. And I have to say, after a couple minutes, it was clear. I was not going inside. Now, this situation irked me. It was clear that I didn't have the voice. I didn't have the authority. I didn't have the language to change the beliefs of an institution that said, even if you wanted to earn your pay, even if you needed your pay, you can't get it. You need someone else to say you're okay. On the other hand, it was clear that HR was just doing their job. It wasn't their fault. And yet I couldn't help but link this to what it is I teach and I study, and that is people in history who have been told that they don't count, who have been told that they don't matter, that they don't have a voice and they don't get a vote, and if they try to use their voices, they'll be told to be quiet, and if they try again, they'll be made to be quiet. Often, when I try to explain to people what it is I do, especially to students who have to go on this journey with me, I tell them that I tell old stories to push for new thinking. And I ask students, what would you do if you didn't have a voice? What would you do if you didn't have the language to change the beliefs? Now, to help them answer this question, I teach something called rhetoric. Now, I'm fully aware that rhetoric is not a popular word. I know that it usually means hot air or empty words, or let's be real, people usually think it means BS. But I assure you, it's an ancient discipline, and Aristotle defined rhetoric as the ability, in each particular case, to see the available means of persuasion. And I actually embrace a more contemporary definition, one put forward by one of the leading theorists in our field, Carlin Kors Campbell. She argues that part of rhetoric's power is its ability to see in the language the symbols that can challenge social truths. Now, what are social truths? Well, they're not truths with a capital T. They're not permanent, immutable meanings. Social truths are commonly held beliefs or assumptions that a culture or a subculture take to be true. So to illustrate, I usually pull up social truths that have applied to women in the past. So let's pretend it's 100 years ago. It's 1913. We would all believe that since women's brains are smaller than men's brains, that clearly they're not capable of the same level of intellectual thinking as men. It was also thought that since women can't consume as many calories or eat as much as men, that they didn't even have the energy to process thoughts as quickly as men. It was also thought that since women were typically doing what was expected of them, which was have babies, that whatever calories they did take in all went to their uterus. Yeah, there weren't enough calories left over to go to their brains. The two just couldn't work at the same time. Right. Now, clearly, these are fairly humorous to us today, but we need to ask ourselves, what social truths do we share that our society will find funny 100 years from now? And what will it take to change them? Who will use the language to change the beliefs? Now, to illustrate how this works, I like to tell one of my favorite old stories. And it's a story about an abolitionist woman named Angelina Grimké. She was born and raised on a slave-owning plantation in South Carolina. And having seen and having witnessed firsthand the horrors of slavery, she fled to the north as a young adult with her sister Sarah, and she joined the abolitionist movement. And it was clear from the beginning that Angelina was very gifted at rhetoric. She published letters in an anti-slavery journal. She published a pamphlet to the Christian women of the South, appealing to them. She engaged in a public exchange of letters with another abolitionist woman who didn't think it was okay for Angelina to speak in public. See, Angelina confronted some social truths of her own. First, it became clear to her that most Northerners weren't fully aware of the horrors of slavery. They mostly thought it just kind of wasn't that bad. It was also clear that from within the circle of social reformers that Angelina worked with, that women weren't welcome to speak in public. It was thought that if a woman appeared in public or stood on a public stage alone without a man, that she was an impure woman. She was a woman of loose morals. It was also thought that the audiences who would come and see such a woman speak, they were called promiscuous audiences. That's what they were called. So let's just play this out here for a little bit. If this was happening 180 years ago, I would be a pretty immoral woman, which makes all of you one really promiscuous audience. Yeah. Good. Excellent. But Angelina just didn't care. She was a gifted speaker. And between 1837 and 1838, she went on a public speaking tour, and she caused a sensation. The groups that came to see her grew and grew and grew, and eventually an abolitionist organization built a hall called Pennsylvania Hall just for these kinds of meetings. And on May 17th, 1838, she got up to speak, to address 3,000 people. And by the time it was her turn to talk, an anti-abolitionist mob had surrounded the building. They were chanting and shouting and throwing rocks at the windows, and being the skilled rhetorician that she was, using the resources available to her, she decided she wasn't going to compete with that noise. She was going to use it. And eventually in her speech, she said, "What is a mob? What would the breaking of every window be? What would the leveling of this hall be? Any evidence that we are wrong or that slavery is a good and wholesome institution? What if the mob should now burst in upon us, break up our meeting, and commit violence upon our persons? Would this be anything compared with what the slaves endure?" Angelina was able to finish her speech and leave the hall untouched. But later that night, the mob burnt the hall down. At great risk to her life and to her health, she used the language to change the beliefs. She made her audience of Northerners feel, even to the slightest extent, the same horror and threat that slaves lived with day in and day out. She was also able to show that a woman can speak in public, that she can think as quickly and as intelligently as any man. Now, changing social truths isn't something just reserved for the 19th century. We have to ask ourselves, which ones are we changing today? Does anybody here not know what that phrase means? Well, as recently as 30 years ago, this phrase was not part of our common vocabulary. So what did victims of what is now defined of as a crime say? What language did they have to point to say, that's what happened to me, and he was wrong? What about lawmakers and judges? What language did they have to point to in the law to say, you did this, it's a crime, and it's punishable? They didn't, because the language didn't exist. Scholars often point to the work that a phrase like this can do to empower victims of social truths. The same social truths that said it was immoral for Angelina to appear in public and to speak in public and was worthy of mob violence were the same ones that suggested that victims of this crime asked for it, wanted this to happen to them, this violence. Change the language, you change the beliefs. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is going on in our society when, in the last year, we've had policymakers utter the phrases legitimate rape and the rape thing? It's clear we have more rhetorical work to do to change the language, to change the beliefs. Now, back to that story about me wanting to teach my class and not being able to at what absolutely must have been the last second. I did get a call from my doctor's office, and I was free and clear. I was free to teach and free to get paid. And even though I was free and clear, there were still just a few little things about this that bothered me. It occurred to me that not all women would be so lucky. Maybe they wouldn't have doctors who would give them the clearance to go back and work. Maybe they wouldn't be well enough to even be able to go back to work 2 weeks after having a baby. It also occurred to me that, maybe it wasn't the note that bothered me. Because let's be honest, my doctor has a wealth of knowledge about medicine and the body that I don't have. I probably should have checked in with her. Maybe what bothered me was that I wouldn't have needed this note if I didn't feel like I had to go back to work in the first place. If I wasn't going to lose my pay, if I lived in a society that valued my voice and valued my authority more, but also valued my health and valued my body more. So what do? We change the language, we change the beliefs.